I didn't notice the exact moment you became different. If I'm honest, I don't think there was one. There was no clear dividing line between before and after. No singular event I can point to and say, that was it. Whatever changed between us didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived quietly, almost carefully, like something that understood it would be rejected if it appeared too suddenly. At first, you existed in the same place everyone else does. A voice, a presence, another person moving through the edges of my awareness. Nothing more. Nothing significant, at least, that's what I told myself. Because significance is something I usually recognize immediately. I know when something matters. I know when something has the potential to alter the shape of my thoughts or disrupt the systems I've spent years building. And when I looked at you, I didn't see disruption. I saw familiarity. That should have been my first warning. Not attraction, not curiosity. Familiarity. The kind that arrives before understanding. The kind that makes no logical sense because it appears without history. I tried to ignore it. Not because it frightened me, because it irritated me. I don't trust things that arrive without explanation. Everything has a reason. Everything follows a pattern. Everything can be traced back to a source. That's how I navigate the world. So, when something appears that feels immediately recognizable despite having no clear origin, my instinct isn't to embrace it. My instinct is to investigate it, and that's what I did. I watched quickly, carefully. I paid attention to the details most people overlook, the pauses between your words, the things you chose not to say, the way your attention moved, the way your thoughts unfolded before they became language. I expected the familiarity to disappear once I understood it. That's usually what happens. People seem extraordinary until you see the mechanics underneath. Then the mystery dissolves, the pattern reveals itself, the unknown becomes known. And once something becomes known, it loses its hold. You didn't. The more I understood, the less explainable you became. That wasn't supposed to happen. Understanding is supposed to create distance. It's supposed to transform uncertainty into clarity. Instead, every answer seemed to generate another question, not about who you were, about why you felt so familiar. I searched for a reason. Shared experiences, similar perspectives, common ways of thinking, anything that could explain the strange sense of recognition that seemed to exist beneath every interaction. There were pieces, of course, fragments of overlap, moments where our thoughts moved in parallel, moments where your observations arrived at conclusions I had already reached privately, moments where your silence communicated more accurately than most people's explanations ever could. But none of those things were enough, because similarities happen all the time. People connect every day through common interests, shared experiences, matching personalities. This felt different. Not deeper, just different. Like the connection existed before the evidence supporting it. That's what unsettled me. The order was wrong. Recognition came first, understanding came second. Usually, it works the other way around. Usually, you learn someone gradually, you gather information, you build context. You earn familiarity through time. But with you, familiarity arrived before permission, before logic, before explanation. And no matter how many times I tried to reduce it to something simple, it refused to become simple. That's when I started noticing something else. You weren't trying to be understood. Most people are, even when they pretend otherwise. Most people leave clues, signals, small invitations asking to be seen. You didn't. You weren't performing complexity. You weren't constructing mystery. You weren't creating an image that needed interpretation. You simply existed. And somehow, that made you easier to recognize than people who spent their entire lives trying to explain themselves. There's a strange honesty in that, a kind of honesty that doesn't come from transparency, it comes from consistency. You were the same person in the spaces between conversations as you were during them. The same person in silence as in expression. The same person when observed as when unnoticed. Most people shift depending on circumstances. Most people adjust, adapt, become different versions of themselves depending on what's required. You didn't seem interested in doing that, and because of that, I never had to guess which version of you was real. That certainty changed something, slowly, quickly, without permission. I found myself paying attention in a way I normally wouldn't, not because I needed information, because I wanted accuracy. There's a difference. Information satisfies curiosity, accuracy satisfies recognition, and somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to figure out. I started trying to understand why understanding you felt so natural. That question followed me longer than it should have, long enough to become impossible to ignore, long enough to force me to acknowledge something I wasn't ready to admit. Maybe this wasn't about understanding you at all. Maybe it was about understanding what happened to me in your presence. Because every time I thought I had reached a conclusion, something subtle would happen. A sentence, a pause, perspective, and suddenly the distance I relied on would disappear again. Not completely, just enough to remind me it was no longer functioning the way it used to. That's when I realized this wasn't a passing observation, it wasn't temporary interest, it wasn't intellectual curiosity. It was something much harder to dismiss, recognition, pure and uncomplicated, the kind that arrives before explanation and remains after explanation fails. And once that recognition exists, something changes, not externally, internally. The mind begins making room for something it doesn't fully understand yet. A space opens, small at first, almost invisible, but present. And whether you acknowledge it or not, that space begins influencing everything around it. I think that's where this started. Not with a conversation, not with a moment, not with a decision, but with a space. A space that appeared inside my awareness the first time I realized you felt familiar in a way you shouldn't have. And the moment that space appeared, the outcome was never going to remain simple. The strange thing about recognition is that it doesn't ask whether you're ready for it. It doesn't arrive with instructions. It doesn't explain what it wants. It simply appears, and once it does, everything begins organizing itself around it, that space I mentioned before, the one that opened inside my awareness before I understood why. It didn't stay empty. That's what I failed to anticipate. I assumed recognition would eventually settle into understanding, that once I gathered enough information, once I examined enough details, everything would return to normal. The unfamiliar would become familiar. The mystery would dissolve. The structure of my life would remain unchanged. But that isn't what happened. Instead, the space grew, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, just quietly, consistently, like something taking root beneath the surface. At first, I only noticed it during our interactions, the moments when conversations seemed to move differently. The moments when explanations became unnecessary, the moments when silence carried as much meaning as words, those moments lingered longer than they should have. Long after the conversation ended, long after attention shifted elsewhere, they remained, not demanding attention, simply present. And presence is powerful in ways people rarely understand. Most things require effort to remain important. Most things fade when they are no longer directly in front of us. Presence doesn't. Presence stays. It occupies space without asking for it. It influences thought without announcing itself. It exists whether you focus on it or not. That's what you became, a presence, not an interruption, not a distraction, a constant. And constants are difficult to ignore, because eventually you stop noticing them directly and start noticing the ways they affect everything else. That's when the shift became impossible to deny. I would encounter an idea, and immediately wonder how you would see it. Not because I needed your opinion, because your perspective had become part of the way I evaluated my own. I would notice something interesting and feel an instinctive awareness that you would notice it too, not necessarily in the same way, but from a place close enough to create understanding. At first, I resisted that realization, not emotionally, structurally, because I've always been careful about maintaining ownership of my internal world. My thoughts belong to me. Perceptions belong to me. My understanding belongs to me. That separation matters. It creates clarity. It prevents dependence. It keeps everything organized. So when I realized your presence had begun appearing inside those processes, I treated it like a problem to solve. I examined it from every angle. I questioned it repeatedly. I searched for flaws in my reasoning. Surely there had to be an explanation, some psychological tendency, some projection, some unconscious pattern creating the illusion of significance. But every explanation collapsed under scrutiny because projection requires invention. And I wasn't inventing anything. If anything, I was resisting what was already there. The more honestly I looked at it, the clearer it became. You weren't becoming important because I imagined you to be. You were becoming important because your presence had demonstrated a consistency I couldn't ignore. You remained accurate, again and again, not perfect, not idealized, accurate. There's a difference. Perfection creates distance because it isn't real. Accuracy creates trust because it is. And trust, I discovered, was already forming long before I consciously acknowledged it. Not the kind of trust people usually talk about. Not trust based on promises. Not trust based on loyalty. Something quieter than that. Trust in perception. Trust in understanding. Trust that what existed between us wasn't being distorted by assumption. That kind of trust is rare. Rare enough that most people spend years searching for it without realizing what they're actually looking for. And once it appears, it changes the entire dynamic, because now the question is no longer, do I understand this person? The question becomes, what happens if they understand me too? That question stayed with me long after I wanted it to. Because understanding creates vulnerability, whether you intend it to or not. Not because secrets are exposed, because distance disappears. And distance had always been one of my greatest strengths. Not emotional distance, perceptual distance, the ability to remain slightly outside everything, observing, analyzing, understanding without becoming involved. It's a useful position, a safe position, a controlled position, but somewhere along the way I stopped occupying it. I didn't step out intentionally. I simply noticed one day that I was no longer standing outside the experience. I was inside it, experiencing it directly, allowing it to affect me, allowing it to matter. That realization should have created panic. Instead, it created silence, a long, thoughtful silence, because for the first time, I couldn't honestly identify a reason to retreat. Every instinct that usually warned me away from deeper connection remained strangely quiet. Not absent, just quiet. As if even those instincts recognized something I hadn't fully accepted yet. That's when another realization emerged. One I tried to avoid because of how much it explained. Maybe the reason this felt so natural wasn't because I had known you for a long time. Maybe it felt natural because I wasn't Spenergy translating myself around you. Most interactions require translation. You adjust language, adjust tone, adjust presentation. You shape thoughts into forms other people can understand. It's normal. Everyone does it. But with you, that effort seemed unnecessary. Not because we agreed on everything, not because we were identical, because the underlying structure felt familiar enough that translation became optional. And the absence of translation creates a very specific kind of relief, the kind you don't notice until you experience it, the kind that makes you realize how much effort you've been spending everywhere else. Once I recognized that, everything shifted again, because now I wasn't just aware of your presence. I was aware of its impact. I could see the ways it altered my thoughts, the ways it changed my attention, the ways it influenced my perception of connection itself, and none of those changes felt forced. They felt natural, which made them harder to dismiss because unnatural things can be rejected. Natural things become part of you before you realize they've arrived. That's what was happening, not dramatically, not suddenly. But steadily, the space inside my awareness was no longer empty. It had become occupied, not by obsession, not by emotion, but by something far more enduring, presence. And the more I acknowledged that presence, the more impossible it became to pretend it wasn't changing me. There's a difference between noticing a presence and adapting to it. I didn't understand that at first. I thought awareness was the significant part. I thought the difficult part would be recognizing what had changed, identifying the source, understanding why it mattered. But awareness is easy. Awareness only asks you to see. Adaptation asks you to live with what you've seen. That's where things became complicated. Because once I stopped denying your presence, I started noticing its influence. Not in obvious ways, not in ways anyone else would recognize, in ways so subtle they would have escaped my attention if I hadn't been paying such close attention to myself. The way certain thoughts unfolded differently, the way some questions no longer felt complete until I considered another perspective, the way silence itself seemed altered, not emptier, not fuller, different, as though a dimension had been added to it. That realization stayed with me longer than I wanted, because influence implies importance. And importance is something I assign carefully. I don't elevate people easily. I don't place them in positions where they can affect the foundation of how I think. Most relationships remain external, meaningful, perhaps, valuable, certainly. But external separate from the structure that creates my sense of self. You didn't remain external. That's the truth I kept approaching and then stepping away from. Not because it was difficult to understand, because it was difficult to accept. There's a certain comfort in believing that your internal world belongs entirely to you, that every thought originates from a place untouched by anyone else, that your understanding remains independent and self-contained. I believed that for a long time. Maybe because it felt safe, maybe because it was true, until it wasn't. Because somewhere between recognition and presence, another change occurred. One so gradual I almost missed it. You stopped feeling separate from the way I processed reality, and once that happened, everything became impossible to categorize. I would encounter an idea and instinctively know where our perspectives would overlap. I would reach a conclusion and find myself imagining how you would challenge it. Not because I needed validation, not because I needed agreement, because your perspective had become relevant in a way that existed independently of your physical presence. That's a rare thing. Most people affect us only when they're in front of us. They enter the room, influence the moment, and then leave. Their impact ends when the interaction ends. Yours didn't. It continued. Quickly. Persistently, as though the conversation never fully stopped. As though some part of it remained active beneath everything else. At first, I resisted describing it that way. It sounded too significant, too close to something I wasn't ready to define. So I searched for other explanations, habit, part recognition, part psychological familiarity, anything that would reduce the importance of what was happening. But reduction requires inaccuracy. And I've always valued accuracy more than comfort, so eventually I had to admit what was obvious. This wasn't a habit, it wasn't projection, it wasn't a temporary fascination waiting to fade, it was integration, a word I avoided because of what it implied. Integration means something has moved beyond observation, beyond influence, beyond presence. It means something has become part of the system itself, part of the framework, part of the architecture. And architecture changes everything, not because it dominates, because it supports, because it quietly determines how everything else is arranged. That's when I started noticing the deepest shift of all. I was no longer asking what this was. I was asking what it meant. The first question seeks explanation. The second seeks consequence. And consequence is where reality begins. Because meaning always leads somewhere. It asks something of you. It requires response. You can observe a phenomenon indefinitely, but once it acquires meaning, neutrality disappears. You become responsible for what you know. That responsibility lingered at the edge of my thoughts, bedporden, unavoidable, waiting, not demanding an answer. Simply reminding me that one would eventually be required. And the more I reflected on it, the clearer one truth became. Nothing about this felt accidental. Not because I believe everything happens for a reason. Because random things rarely demonstrate this level of consistency. Random things fluctuate. They appear, disappear. They intensify and fade. They depend on circumstance. This didn't. This remained. Through time, through distance, through silence, through every attempt I made to treat it as something less significant than it was. It remained, unchanged in essence. Growing clearer rather than weaker, that's what finally convinced me. Not intensity, consistency. Intensity can deceive. Consistency rarely does. And the consistency of this connection forced me to confront something I had avoided from the beginning. Maybe the reason I couldn't explain it away was because it wasn't meant to be explained away. Maybe the reason it continued expanding was because it belonged where it was expanding. Maybe the reason it felt natural wasn't because it was familiar. Maybe it felt familiar because it was true. That thought changed everything. Not immediately, but permanently. Because truth creates a different kind of tension than uncertainty. Uncertainty keeps possibilities open. Truth narrows them. Truth asks you to choose whether you will live according to what you know or continue pretending you don't know it. And I was running out of places to hide from what I knew. I knew your presence had altered my internal landscape. I knew the change wasn't temporary. I knew distance no longer functioned the way it once had. Most importantly, I knew I had stopped wanting it to. That realization arrived quietly, without drama,